So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, colleague Prof. Helmond, thanks for your kind words. Well, in my paper, I want to take the situation of the Catholic Church in the Netherlands as a starting point for some general observations how the Church can overcome polarization through participation. Well, since the 60s of last century, the Catholic Church in the Netherlands has been marked by a fierce polarization, as you probably have noticed in the media throughout the last decades. By way of illustration, and without having any intention to be complete, I mention a few of its important causes. First, most people in the Netherlands have strong and equally diverging opinions on religious issues and are used to express them loudly in the public debate. Second, after the Second World War, many Dutch Catholics were convinced that their social emancipation was only completed if they totally identified with mainstream secular society. Others, by contrast, wanted to hold on to the compartmentalized society of the first half of the 20th century. Third factor, a lot of Dutch Catholics saw the Second Vatican Council only as a starting point for an even more radical opening up of the Church to secular society, and consequently wanted to implement the decisions of the Council as fast as possible in the life of the Church of the Netherlands. Others, however, experienced the disappearance of a pre-Vatican Church, which was clearly identifiable, hierarchically structured, and predominantly inwardly orientated, as a loss. Especially the adaptation of the traditional liturgy with its smells and bells was the cause of fierce polarization among many loyal Catholics. Well, this example shows, in my view, what was fundamentally divided conservatives and liberals, not only in the Netherlands, by the way, but also in many other Western countries, was the question how the Church should relate to the modern secular world. Now, 50 years later, it is clear that the costs of this polarization have been considerable. The conservative option has led to retrenchment of the Church into a small defensive bulwark against modernity, whereas the liberal option has resulted in a Church that has lost a great deal of its identity and attractiveness because it proved to be unable to distinguish itself from secular society at large. And I'm not the only one who have been mentioning this. Father Halic and others have been pointing to the same phenomenon. Well, in the next section of this paper, I want to situate this polarization in the Catholic Church against the broader horizon of the fundamentally paradoxical nature of the relation of the Church to the world. And on the basis of this short analysis, I will develop in my final section the idea of a Church that is, in my view, able to serve the world by presenting itself as a tradition of practical wisdom. For those of you who are interested in a more detailed analysis of the recent evolution of the Catholic Church in the Netherlands and the rest of Europe, as well as some philosophical and theological suggestions of how the Church can find a new appeal and a new way of dealing with the secular world, I refer to the volume which my colleague Prof. Hellemans and I edited, A Catholic Minority Church in the World of Seekers, as part of the large project Faith in a Secular Age, which was started under the aegis of Charles Taylor and José Casanova. Well, in his address in Freiburg of September 2011, Pope Emeritus Benedict gave an intriguing analysis of the paradoxical nature of the Church's relationship with the world by commenting on the proverb of the Gospel that Christians should be in, but not of the world. In his view, the Church, I quote, in order to accomplish its mission, will need again and again to set itself apart from its surroundings, to become, in a certain sense, unworldly, entweltlich in German. He defines a worldly church as a church which becomes self-satisfied, settles down in this world, becomes self-sufficient, and adapts itself to the standards of the world. Hence, Benedict welcomes the secularization process which has liberated the Church from its material and political burdens and privileges as a necessary step in order to untie the traditional but problematic knot between church and society. He qualifies this process not as a loss, but rather as the liberation of the church from all kinds of problematic forms of worldliness. Well, with this warning of a church that has become too much of the world, Benedict expresses his opposition against the above-mentioned liberal option. Given his conservative reputation, this should be no surprise. But his proposal for a church's detachment from the modern world should not be misunderstood as a plea for the conservative option either, namely for a complete withdrawal of the church from the world, since this would run counter to the admonition of the gospel that Christians should be in the world. In Benedict's view, a church which is in the world is far better equipped to fulfill its missionary task. It can reach out more effectively and in a truly Christian way to the world and be truly open to it. To phrase it paradoxically, insofar as it resolutely moves away from its worldliness, that is, from its problematic alliance with the world as it actually is, the Church opens up afresh to the cares of the world to which she herself belongs and gives herself over to them. However, in spite of all his good intentions, one can ask whether Benedict's fierce opposition to the modern world has not resulted in a church that has become completely out of touch with it, so that it eventually, its voice will not be heard anymore by the world. In particular, many people have the impression that the church often does not open up to their cares, but overpowers their authentic search for meaning and hope with fixed certainties and abstract doctrinal truths. So the question remains how the church can conjoin with the world again, but without losing its identity in today's secular world. This idea of a serving church points to a possible answer, and I want to develop a specific aspect of what such a serving church could look like by examining the idea of Christian wisdom. So, my next section, a church that serves through wisdom. As the speaker of yesterday already pointed out, there are a lot of signs that wisdom may be making a comeback after being associated for a long time with old people, tradition, and conservative caution in a culture of youth, modernization, innovation, and risky exploration. The revival of wisdom is especially evident in areas where knowledge and technical know-how come up against questions of ethics, values, beauty, the shaping and flourishing of the whole person, the common good, and long-term perspectives. As is common knowledge, the examples of wisdom abound in Christian faith, from the books of wisdom and the sayings of Jesus to the life stories of the people who live by them. All traditions of wisdom, Christian and other ones, religious and secular ones, consist in the ability to combine an insight in the true nature of the good life in general with the practical knowledge of how contingencies of individual human lives. This enables these traditions to reach their final goal, namely, to assist people in their search for a truthful orientation of their lives. Quoting Aristotle in this respect, someone is considered a person of practical wisdom if he is able to deliberate well about what is good and expedient for himself, not in some particular respects, but about what sorts of thing conduce to the good life in general. The capacity to deliberate, which is commonly called prudence, is essential for wisdom, because it is always dealing with contingent matters. Prudence is first of all a reflection which starts from the particularity and plurality of human life and connects it with the general principles of the good life. A wise person, in other words, is someone who has a sensitivity to the concrete particular situation of his own life and that of others, and situates it against a broader horizon. However, wisdom cannot be reduced to a kind of practical know-how or to a drawing up of an inventory of the contingencies of human life. Rather, it also involves a fundamental reflection on the true nature of the good, relating it to particular life situations. Hence, in spite of wisdom's close relation to the concrete lives of people, it cannot content itself with deliberating about the contingencies of life. Such an approach fails to fulfill one of the essential requirements of wisdom, namely to give an orientation to people's contingent life from the perspective of the good life in general. In this respect, there is a striking difference between traditional and contemporary views on practical wisdom. Most traditional forms of wisdom are rather theoretical, focused on judging in a very general sense about the true ends of life, thereby raising themselves above the contingencies of human life. But by doing so, these traditions run the risk of losing their connection with the concrete lives of people. Contemporary manifestations of wisdom, by contrast, are far more closely related to people's social and temporal settings. But because of this, they run another risk, namely of failing to critically examine the hidden assumptions of these settings, so that wisdom, at the end of the day, is nothing more than an ideological justification of the existing order, instead of giving a true orientation to people's lives. Well, insofar as Christian faith is a tradition of wisdom, it typically aims at combining these two aspects of wisdom in order to avoid the above-mentioned pitfalls. One can say that Christian faith is primarily a way of life, consisting in putting one's life in the sign of the risen Lord. From this perspective, faith is an expression of practical wisdom, that is, a series of concrete, practical suggestions to follow a path of life consisting in letting one's everyday existence be orientated by a transcendent promise of eternal bliss. This means that in order to prevent Christian faith from falling into the pitfall of a disconnection from the concrete lives of the faithful, its theoretical, doctrinal aspect should remain subordinated to its tradition of practical wisdom. A concrete way to do so is the revaluation of the cardinal virtue of prudence, because that way the Church shows that it takes the individuality and plurality of human lives seriously and does not suffocate their authentic search for meaning in life with abstract doctrinal principles. But then, of course, the question rises how to relate the concrete contingent lives of people to the Christian tradition as a truthful normative orientation. Especially from the context of contemporary culture, with its extreme focus on the contingent situation of the individual in his social and temporal setting. This is where the second pitfall looms. If the Christian message is too accommodating and does not hold a mirror up to our face, faith loses its life-orientating character and, hence, is no true wisdom anymore. Especially in our times of radical religious, but I agree with the previous speaker, also moral pluralism, in which most of points of orientation seems to have become obsolete, people start looking again for a truthful orientation to their lives by putting them into a larger perspective. Well, in my view, this situation offers new opportunities for a serving church. If it succeeds in presenting faith as an expression of true wisdom at the service of people who look for orientation, it will regain its attractiveness and conjoin with the contemporary world in an authentic way, namely by being in but not of the world. Well, in order to realize this, the church needs men and women who are trained in translating the general principles of Christian doctrine in such a way that they can fulfill a truly orientating role for the existential questions and search of today's people, and hence can also be understood by non-believers. But as practical wisdom, one also needs men and women who practice the virtue of prudence, that is, who are sensitive to the particular circumstances of people's lives and who are able to interpret these in the light of the life of Jesus, and who can balance people's own desires over against those of others, and who finally judge their ideals and acts in the light of the broader and more far-reaching ideal of the divine life. Only if the Church succeeds in responding to this twofold challenge of practical Christian wisdom, it will be able to be a truly servant church for our time. Thank you.